Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, July 17th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Biden says that he has done more for the Palestinians than anyone else. So President Biden claimed in an interview published on Monday that he has done more for the Palestinian community than anyone else. And of course, these comments come after over 9 months of his administration giving Israel all these weapons and all this political support, intelligence support to carry out this genocidal war against the Palestinians in Gaza. So this was a YouTube show called 360 with Speedy that I've never heard of, but the guy interviewed Biden, and Biden said, quote, "I'm the guy that did more for the Palestinian community than anybody. I'm the guy that opened up all the assets. I'm the guy that made sure that I got the Egyptians to open the border to let goods and medicine and food through," end quote. So notice what he cites as being an example of him helping the Palestinian community, getting the Rafah border crossing open for aid deliveries. Well, he also supported Israel, gave Netanyahu the green light to capture the Rafah border crossing back in May, and it's been closed ever since. And Biden also appeared to suggest in this interview that he has only provided defensive weapons to Israel, even though his administration has shipped tens of thousands of bombs and other types of munitions. So I just transcribed it as he said it. So it's a little clunky here. But he said, quote, "I sent defensive weapons. I denied them offensive weapons that they were using 2,000-pound bombs and the rest because I made it real clear they cannot use weapons that we provide them to, in fact, use in civilian areas," end quote. So in his jumbled words there, he said that we provide them weapons to use in civilian areas, but he's trying to say that he didn't want them to do that. But either way, I mean, it's nonsense because they have been using them on civilian areas. I mean, the idea that they're not, that the U.S. isn't giving them offensive weapons, I mean, it's just completely absurd. And, there's no consequences here for Biden just completely lying about his what he's been doing for these past 9 months. And in these comments, he appeared to be referring to his administration pausing a shipment of 2,000-pound bombs and 500-pound bombs. But the 500-pound bombs, they're already on their way. They've apparently agreed to send them over, despite Israel continuing to bomb civilian areas. And the administration did pause a single shipment of 2,000-pound bombs, but that was after it shipped 14,000 of them to Israel, and that was all after October 7th. And Israel is still using them on civilians, and that the strike on the Al-Mawasi camp that Israel claimed targeted Mohammed Daif, the Hamas military commander, which Hamas denied. Israeli officials said that they used 5 2,000-pound bombs in that attack, and that was in an area where there was tents where civilians, women, and children were seeking refuge in a so-called safe zone. In the interview, Biden expressed strong support for Israel and the idea of Zionism. He said, quote, "Do you know what a Zionist is? If there weren't in Israel, every Jew in the world would be at risk. There's a need for it to be strong and a need for Israel to be able to have, after World War II, the ability for Jews to have a place that was their own. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist," end quote. So I pointed to comments from Lily Greenberg Call, who's a Jewish American who resigned from the Interior Department over Biden's support for the slaughter in Gaza. And she criticized in her resignation letter and in interviews that she did, she criticized Biden for saying this. He says this a lot, that, if it wasn't for Israel, there would be no safe place for Jews in the world. And she said in her resignation letter, quote, "Jewish safety cannot and will not come at the expense of Palestinian freedom. Making Jews the face of the American war machine makes us less safe," end quote. So just a bunch of nonsense from President Biden, which I guess isn't really a surprise. All right, so the next one here, Israeli attacks killed dozens of Palestinians in southern and central Gaza. Heavy Israeli airstrikes on Gaza throughout the day on Tuesday. This is an article from Al Jazeera just kind of summarizing the strikes across the Strip. Dozens of Palestinians have been killed in Israeli air raids in southern and central Gaza, including one that struck an Israeli-designated safe zone crowded with thousands of displaced people, Palestinian health officials said. An air raid on Tuesday hit a main street lined with market stalls outside the city of Khan Yunis in Al-Mawasi, at the heart of the zone that is packed with shelters for displaced people. Again, that's the so-called safe zone. That's where Israel told people fleeing Rafah and Khan Yunis to go. Officials at Khan Yunis's Nasser Hospital said 17 people were killed in that strike. At least 23 Palestinians were killed and 73 others were wounded in an attack on the UN's Al-Razi school in the Nusret camp in central Gaza, according to Gaza's government media office. Video footage verified by Al Jazeera's fact-checking agency showed a young man carrying what appeared to be the remnants of the rockets that targeted the school. Among those killed was a local journalist, Mohammed Mesh, taking the number of journalists killed in the conflict to 160. Reporting from Deir al-Bala in central Gaza, there are chaotic scenes inside the hospitals and everything. So the heavy strikes in Gaza continue. It just feels like there's so much less attention on this now with everything else that's been going on. All right, the next one here, Israeli military says it is facing shortages of tanks and ammo. This is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. The Israeli Defense Forces said that it was facing a shortage of functioning tanks and shells. The admission came in a court filing explaining why the IDF was not allowing female tank soldiers in Gaza. So on Monday, the IDF informed the Israeli High Court that many of its tanks were damaged during operations in Gaza. The Israeli military added it was facing a shortage of tank shells. The case was started by female IDF tank soldiers who engaged in operations in southern Israel on October 7th, who have been denied requests to deploy to Gaza. Apparently, they're asking to go into Gaza. So the IDF wrote in its response to the court, quote, "The number of operational tanks in the Corps is insufficient for the needs of the war and for conducting experiments of the deployment of women. We are working to increase the arsenal. The IDF has been recruiting extraordinarily large numbers to replace the missing soldiers and cannot allocate manpower for such experiments while the war continues," end quote. The IDF says it will not allow female tank soldiers to serve in combat until at least November 2025. So something we've seen, Hamas post online is these videos of them firing rockets at Israeli tanks and destroying them. So it looks like they have been doing some damage there. And apparently they have shortages of tank shells. The U.S. has sent them a lot of tank shells. From October to December 2023, the U.S. has sent nearly 14,000 tank shells. So that's, again, from October to December 2023. So that's not a very long period of time. And the U.S. government has not been transparent at all about what it's been sending Israel. So we don't actually know the number of, full number of tank shells, artillery shells, and everything. There's been some reports that reveal, the number of heavy bombs that they send. But when it comes to kind of the smaller stuff, we don't really know. And it's something with Ukraine. Whenever they announce military aid for Ukraine, they put out this big fact sheet that lists the number of things. I'm sure they've hidden some stuff there too, but lists the number of artillery shells and everything that they've sent to Ukraine. But with Israel, they're not really sharing any information. All right, so the next one here, Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon kill 3 children. So Lebanese security sources revealed that multiple Israeli strikes carried out across southern Lebanon killed at least 5 civilians. This was on Tuesday, and they were all Syrian. They all happen to be Syrian nationals. An air raid on the farmland of Tut killed 3 Syrian children. Israel has regularly attacked South Lebanese farmland, badly damaging the largely agricultural economy while simultaneously talking up an invasion of the country. Lebanese news agency sources reported that Israel also attacked a motorcycle, killing 2 Syrian civilians who had been swimming in the area. So there was different strikes, one on the farmland that killed the children, and then the strike on the motorcycle. This continues. There was other attacks, and white phosphorus shells were launched in other parts of Lebanon. So it sounds like some pretty heavy strikes. And Hezbollah responded to the killings by firing about 40 rockets against northern Israel's Galilee panhandle. Some of the rockets were reported intercepted, and there was no reports of casualties. So again, very heavy. And at least, so since October 7th, at least 511 people have been killed in Lebanon, including over 100 civilians. All right, so the next one here. Powerful Israeli minister calls on Netanyahu to annex the West Bank. So this is another one from Kyle. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich is demanding that Prime Minister Netanyahu take steps to thwart the creation of a Palestinian state, including annexing the West Bank. The official wants to make a move in response to an expected World Court ruling against the Israeli settlement expansions. A Palestinian-controlled West Bank is needed for a two-state solution, obviously. So on Monday, Smotrich told reporters, quote, "I hereby call on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, if the International Court of Justice in The Hague does decide that the settlement enterprise is illegal, respond to them with a historic decision of applying sovereignty to the territories of the homeland," end quote. So the ICJ is considering a case on the settlements that's on top of the, separate from the genocide case, I believe. And, you know, this is something Smotrich, he's not just the finance minister, he also is the minister in charge of the West Bank, essentially, of expanding settlements, demolishing Palestinian structures. And this is something he's been his thing has been in response to these international legal things, the ICC warrants. They accuse the Palestinian Authority of pushing for those ICC warrants. And I believe the recent move to annex, they just did a big land grab in the West Bank of about 5 square miles. I think he was saying that was a response to the PA, pushing for this stuff like the ICC. So now he's saying if the ICJ rules this, we'll just take it, So, and this is something he's wanted for a very long time. He's a settler himself, so it's not surprising to see him say this. All right, so the next one here, Israeli military to begin drafting Ultra-Orthodox seminary students. So this article's from Reuters. The Israeli military will next week begin the process of drafting candidates from Israel's ultra-Orthodox community, the military said on Tuesday. The issue is especially sensitive amid the war against Hamas in Gaza and related fighting on other fronts that have caused the worst Israeli casualties in decades. So Israelis are bound by law to serve in the military from the age of 18 for 24 to 32 months. Members of Israel's 21% Arab minority and ultra-Orthodox Jewish seminary students have largely been exempt for decades. In June, Israel's Supreme Court ruled that the Defense Ministry must end that long-standing exemption for ultra-Orthodox seminary students, creating new political strains for Netanyahu. And this is something, the extremists, you have ultra-Orthodox parties that are part of his coalition, and they're very against all of this. It includes 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, and there have been protests against this by the ultra-Orthodox community. There were some on Tuesday. Some of them were getting locked up. Some were arrested, I believe, by Israeli police. So this is a big thing, source of tensions in internal Israeli domestic politics. All right, so the next one here, J.D. Vance says that Iran needs to be punched hard. So Senator J.D. Vance, Republican of Ohio, he took a hawkish tone toward Iran in an interview following the news that he had been selected as former President Trump's running mate for the November election. So this is an interview that he did on Monday night with Sean Hannity, and he is the... this was like right after, it was announced that he was Trump's pick for vice president, and he came out pretty hot, sounding like a hawk. except for when he discussed Ukraine, which we'll get into that. So Vance told Hannity, quote, "The most important part of the Trump doctrine of foreign policy is you don't commit America's troops unless you really have to, but when you do, you punch and you punch hard. A lot of people recognize that we need to do something with Iran, but not these weak little bombing runs," end quote. And there he seems to be referring to Biden bombing Syria and Iraq recently, targeting the Shia militias. He went on, quote, "If you're going to punch the Iranians, you punch them hard. And that's what Trump did when he took out Soleimani," end quote. And he's referring to General Qasem Soleimani, who was the head of Iran's IRGC's Quds force. He was assassinated by Trump in January 2020. Vance claimed that this assassination brought peace to the region, but I mean, it brought the U.S. and Iran on the brink of a major, direct war. Iran responded by firing a volley of missiles at a U.S. base in Iraq. As far as I understand it, they kind of tipped them off where, they told Iraq where they were going to hit, and then they probably told the Americans. So no Americans were killed, but a lot of troops did suffer traumatic brain injuries. And then just 2 months later, in March 2020, a rocket attack in Iraq that the U.S. blamed on the Iranian-allied Shia militias killed 2 U.S. troops and 1 British soldier. You see this talking point from Republicans a lot that, these attacks stopped under Trump, these types of rocket attacks, similar to the attack that killed 3 U.S. troops earlier this year at that base in Jordan, right on the Syrian border. But these things were happening even right after the Soleimani assassination. So Vance accused Biden of doing nothing about Iran. He said, quote, "You have the infrastructure there, sitting there to weaken Iran, to strengthen our ally Israel. Joe Biden's done nothing with it. Donald Trump will reinvigorate it," end quote. So discussing Israel's genocidal war in Gaza, Vance claimed Biden was not helping Israel, even though the president has, provided all the support. This is the talking point from Republicans. Vance said, quote, "Joe Biden has done nothing to help our ally Israel. Joe Biden has made it harder and harder for Israel to win that war. He has prolonged the war to take out Hamas," end quote. And he's previously said that Biden is micromanaging the Israelis, basically signaling that he favors giving the Israelis whatever they want. So Vance discussed other foreign policy issues, including the conflict in Ukraine. And he's been a leading critic, to give him credit. Since he came in as a senator, he's been, all the letters, all the stuff that you see, action. Unfortunately, there's not enough of them, but there was a solid core of Republicans in the House and a few in the Senate that were opposed to more aid for Ukraine, and he was one of them. And he told Hannity that he believes Trump will be able to negotiate a deal with Russia and Ukraine to bring the war to a rapid close, was the words that he used. So that sounds good, right? But in the next sentence, he says, "And then we'll be able to focus on the real issue, which is China." He described China as the biggest threat facing the U.S., which aligns with the view of the Pentagon. The Pentagon's national defense strategy says China's the top threat, Russia's number 2, then terrorist organization, and then like Iran, and the list goes down from there. But this is something, there's a big U.S. military buildup going on underway right now, and that could lead to another disaster. So it's unfortunate that a lot of the people who are opposed to the Ukraine proxy war, in Congress, this is their line of thinking. And, if you are a China hawk, it makes sense. What's the point of prolonging this, dumping all these resources into Ukraine if you think China is, the big bad threat? But it is, again, something that could turn into disaster. Maybe not as quickly as the war in Ukraine could, but, this is something that could, the way that they talk about China, when you hear the military leaders, they're talking about preparing to fight a direct war with China. So it's very concerning. And I haven't seen Vance say things like that explicitly, but it's just not the best rhetoric that we're seeing from him right off the bat here. All right, so the next one here, this was the big news of the day. CNN claims that the Secret Service ramped up security around Trump over some Iranian plot. So this is something I felt like I had to cover, even though it's probably just a complete nonsense story, but it just got so much attention. So CNN claimed on Tuesday that the U.S. Secret Service ramped up security around Donald Trump in recent weeks based on intelligence from a single human source that Iran was plotting to assassinate the former president. Accusations Tehran rejected as unsubstantiated and malicious. So, again, a human source. It says it came from a human source, a single human source. That sounds like it's just somebody saying something. It doesn't mean that they have some sort of plot, that they've been surveilling some Iranians who are plotting. So it sounds like someone said, hey, maybe the Iranians are going to try to kill Trump or something. The report offered no evidence for the claim. It only cited unnamed people briefed on the matter. And they also said there was no indication that Thomas Matthew Crooks, the 20-year-old who tried to assassinate Trump over the weekend, they said there's no indication that he had any connection to this alleged plot. The idea that the Secret Service increased security around Trump has been contested. Republicans responding to this are saying, well, if the security was ramped up, how did this guy get up on that rooftop? Why wasn't it secured by the Secret Service? It really wasn't far away from where Trump was speaking, so those are the things that they're saying. You say security was increased. It doesn't seem like it was increased. So there's a lot of holes in this story. And so this report connected Trump's assassination of Soleimani, as the motive for Iran to want to plot this. And in response, Iran's mission to the UN, they were asked about this report and said, quote, "These accusations are unsubstantiated and malicious. From the perspective of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Trump is a criminal who must be prosecuted and punished in a court of law for ordering the assassination of General Soleimani. Iran has chosen the legal path to bring him to justice." End quote. IRGC officials occasionally vow that they will seek revenge for Soleimani. They've made threats. But what have we seen? How has Iran been behaving recently? Amid all these really high tensions in the Middle East, they have been very clearly trying to avoid war with with the U.S. And assassinating a former president would be a quick way to provoke, direct military confrontation with the U.S. This year, Iran engaged in indirect talks with the U.S. in Oman to avoid escalation. And they have also, put pressure on the Iraqi Shia militias to stop the attacks on U.S. troops. After the 3 U.S. troops were killed, they really put the squeeze on them. And for the most part, they did stop. There's been a few attacks here and there. And then when Iran launched its reprisal attack on Israel in response to the bombing of the Iranian consulate in Syria, Iranian officials said that they warned the U.S. 72 hours in advance. Now, the U.S. denied that, but Jordan and Turkey said that they got the warning. And if they got the warning, then it got to the U.S. So again, all these signs that Iran wants no part of a conflict, and you might see some hawkish rhetoric from IRGC officials, but the idea that Iran would try to kill Trump, it just seems like such nonsense. So that was the big story of the day that went everywhere, and I was happy to see for the most part it seemed like the Republicans are just kind of looking at this story as nonsense, as a way to kind of put the pressure off the Secret Service, try to blame someone else for what happened. All right, so the next one here, the Kremlin wants Zelensky to clarify the peace summit. So on Tuesday, the Kremlin responded to Zelensky saying Russia should attend the next peace summit on the Ukraine war. The previous summit, held in Switzerland last month, was billed as a peace summit, but Russia was not invited to attend. It's not really a peace summit if one party to the conflict isn't there. So Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, he said, quote, "The first peace summit was not a peace summit at all, so one must understand first what Zelensky has in mind," end quote. So I saw some other Russian politicians, like in the parliament, and lower level foreign ministry officials kind of say, we're not going to go to some, Ukrainian summit. But this comment from the Kremlin, they're not completely ruling it out, which I think is good, because I've seen them say before when asked about it that we wouldn't want to go anyway, when asked when they weren't invited. So at least it seems like there's some kind of door open here for potential talks. And that doesn't mean, I would be surprised, honestly, if Zelensky organizes this summit. He's saying he wants it all finished by, I think they want to hold it in like November or something. So I would be surprised if Russia is actually at the next summit. But just the fact that they're talking about this, I think, is a good sign, hopefully. And I think this could have something to do with the situation, the political realities now, with Trump coming in and him saying he wants a deal. There are certainly some concerning, things there with Trump. The fact that he backed Mike Johnson, as he put forward the $61 billion in aid for Ukraine. But you see, Vance, I think, is serious about ending the proxy war, or at least winding it down. So I think, again, it is a good sign for Ukraine that he picked Vance, even though Vance is a hawk pretty much everywhere else. All right, so the next one here. MEPs want to punish Hungary for Orban's peace mission. So dozens of members of the European Parliament are fuming over Hungarian Prime Minister. I have to correct that. I always accidentally call him the president. Over Orban's recent push for a peace deal in Ukraine, which he began when Hungary took over the rotating EU presidency. So 63 members of the 705-seat European Parliament sent a letter to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and other top EU officials calling for Hungary to be punished for Orban's push for peace, which has involved trips to Kiev, Moscow, and Beijing. They wrote, quote, Orban undertook several diplomatic visits, notably to visit Putin in Russia and Xi Jinping in China, during which he intentionally misrepresented his empowerment. This requires real action, such as suspending Hungary's voting rights in the council, since practice has shown that mere verbal condemnations of this situation have no effect, end quote. EU officials have insisted that Orban doesn't represent the European bloc, despite him taking over the presidency on July 1st. During his recent trip, the Hungarian leader stressed the need for dialogue with Russia, which has been a consistent position of his, putting him at odds with much of the EU and NATO. When he was in Russia, he said, quote, we cannot achieve peace without dialogue and diplomatic channels. I have experienced that the positions are far from each other, but in terms of the restoration of dialogue, the first important step was taken today, end quote. So I do wonder, you had him go talk to Zelensky and say, why don't you consider a ceasefire? I wonder if, Zelensky rejected it publicly, but I do wonder if Orban's efforts here might actually be moving the needle a little bit. Either way, he took over the European. I think it's good to see him take over the EU presidency, and then immediately, one of the first things he does is go to visit all these capitals and say, we need peace in Ukraine. I mean, it is extremely important considering the risk of nuclear war and just everything. All right, so the next one here, Belgorod governor says that Ukraine has killed 200 civilians in the region. So Vyacheslav Gladkov, the governor of Russia's Belgorod Oblast, said on Tuesday that Ukrainian attacks on the border region since February 2022 have killed over 200 civilians. Back in April, he said that the death toll was at 120. And just for context, the UN, their latest estimate in February, put the death toll in Ukraine since Russia invaded at 10,582. This is the civilian death toll that they've confirmed. They said it's probably higher, but that's what they have confirmed. So civilian casualties in Belgorod have spiked in recent weeks as Ukrainian shelling and drone attacks increased after Russia launched its new offensive in Kharkiv. They launched that offensive from Belgorod. Gladkov said in a video on Telegram that civilian access to 14 villages near the border was being restricted due to an uptick in Ukrainian attacks. He said, quote, I hope you will agree that it is unacceptable to let women and children into settlements that are shelled every day. We've already lost a lot of civilians. We have a lot of wounded. And of course, our task is to maximize security measures, end quote. So throughout the war, Ukraine has targeted residential areas of Belgorod with artillery shelling and drone attacks. The U.S. recently gave Ukraine the green light to strike Russian border regions with U.S.-provided weapons, but I have not seen reports of American-made missiles hitting, residential areas, killing civilians in Belgorod. We did see the U.S. missiles attack them, cluster bombs kill civilians in Crimea, but I haven't seen anything in Belgorod. But American weapons have been used in the past, including by these militias that fight for Ukraine, including the Russian Volunteer Corps, which is an openly, neo-Nazi group. They're Russian-born people fighting for Ukraine. And they have launched cross-border raids into Belgorod and have been armed with NATO weaponry, including U.S.-provided armored vehicles. So this is just something that really gets no attention in the Western media. That's why I like to cover it. Just the fact that, there has been a lot of civilian casualties in these Russian border areas that Ukraine has been attacking. All right, so the next one here, Senator Menendez convicted at corruption trial. So Bob Menendez, the New Jersey senator, has been convicted on Tuesday on all 16 criminal counts that he faced, including bribery, at his corruption trial in Manhattan federal court, completing the once powerful New Jersey Democrats' dramatic downfall. So senior Democrats, including Chuck Schumer, are telling him to quit, telling him to resign, and that's it, call it a day. So Menendez, these charges were acting, accepting bribes and basically acting as an agent of the Egyptian government. He was accepting bribes to push policies that benefited Egypt. And he was the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so a very influential Democrat. And he was very hawkish, so good, he stepped down from that position when the case started, but now it looks like he's going to be totally gone. In exchange for bribes, Menendez helped steer billions of dollars in American aid to Egypt, where one of the businessmen had ties to government officials, according to prosecutors. Menendez also was accused of seeking to influence criminal probes involving two other businessmen. So, and when they raided his house, they found cash, like in his shoes, gold bars, like hidden around the house. And, it was like raiding a mobster's house. So it looks like he's done. So that is it for the news for today. Please check out our Viewpoints, one from Ted Snyder. The U.S. continues to undermine its own interests in Iran. One from Ellen Kantorau, a cancer on the West Bank. One from Ivana Nikolic-Hughes and Peter Kuznick. Prolonging the Ukraine war is flirting with nuclear disaster. One from Daniel Larison. Vance is not hiding his hawkishness on Iran. And the spotlight from Senator Rand Paul. Missed chance for peace at NATO summit. So please go check all of that out. Follow us on Instagram. Follow us on X. Follow me on X or Twitter. Like and subscribe. Comment. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. All that stuff. I will be back tomorrow with some more news for you. Thanks for listening.